There we go.
There it is.
All
There you
right,
go.
now we're set. Thanks. All right, let me run this back to the beginning so you don't miss the first words. Share that. Take you back to the beginning. Bible Project.
The letter to the Hebrews. The author of this letter is anonymous, and people have wondered for a long time whether Paul wrote it or maybe one of his co-workers like Barnabas or Apollos, but really we just don't know. In chapter 2, we discover that the author had a first-hand relationship with the disciples who were themselves around Jesus, so we know that this letter is anchored in the teaching of the apostles. We also don't know who the audience of this letter was or even where they lived. The author knows them really well, and he assumes that they have a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, especially the storyline of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, about how Abraham's family became the nation of Israel, about how Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they received the Torah and they made a covenant with God, where they built the tabernacle, where the priests offered sacrifices, and also about how they wandered through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. The author just expects that the readers know all of the details about these stories, and so most likely the audience is made up of Jewish Christians. That's where the name of the letter comes from. We also have clues from chapter 10 that this church community was facing persecution and even imprisonment because of their association with Jesus. Some in the community were walking away from Jesus and abandoning the faith altogether. And this explains the purpose and the structure of this letter. First, there's a short introduction, which is followed by 4 sections where the author compares and contrasts Jesus with key people and events from Israel's history. Jesus is first compared with angels in the Torah, second with Moses and the Promised Land, third with priests and Melchizedek, and lastly with the sacrifices and the covenant. And the author has 2 main goals in all of these contrasts. The first goal is to elevate Jesus as superior to anyone or anything else, showing that Jesus is worthy of all their trust and devotion. But his second goal is this: it's to challenge the readers to remain faithful to Jesus despite persecution. So in every section, he includes a strong warning not to abandon Jesus. So let's dive in now and see how this all unfolds. The elevation of Jesus begins in the opening sentence of the introduction. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors in many different ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. So the author's saying that Jesus is superior to all of the previous ways that God has revealed himself to Israel. He then makes this astounding claim that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's nature. These metaphors are making the closest possible identification between Jesus and God. So Jesus is what the rays of light are to the sun, or Jesus is what the wax impression is to the signet ring. For this author, there is no God apart from Jesus. Jesus is God become human as the Son. And it's this elevated view of Jesus that's then explored throughout the rest of the letter. In the first section, the author compares Jesus with angels, which might strike you as kind of odd, like why angels? In Jewish tradition, it was taught, based on Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, that the Torah and the words of God were delivered to Moses at Mount Sinai by angels. And so by saying that Jesus is superior to angels, the author is claiming that Jesus and his message of good news are superior to all previous messengers of God's word. And so the first warning flows from this very point. If Israel was called to pay attention to the Torah that was delivered by angels, how much more should we pay attention to the message that was announced by the Son of God? And not only that, given Jesus' status high above the angels, how remarkable is it that he gave up that high status to become human, to suffer, and to die? In Jesus, we see God's greatest glory and God's great humility as Jesus sympathetically joined himself to humanity's tragic fate. In chapters 3 and 4, the author moves on to argue that Jesus is superior to Moses, who led the people of Israel through the wilderness and built the tabernacle. Jesus is also the leader of God's people, but in him we see not the builder of just a tent, but of all creation. Then the author retells the story of how the Israelites rebelled against Moses in the wilderness, and they lost their chance to enter into the rest that God offered them in the Promised Land. And so here comes the second warning. If Jesus is greater than Moses, how much higher are the stakes if we rebel against him? We also are in a wilderness-like environment where we have to trust God for the future rest in God's new creation. So let's make sure that we don't rebel like Israel did in the wilderness and lose out on God's gracious offer to enter his new creation. In chapters 5 through 7, the author then compares Jesus with Israel's priests that come from the line of Aaron. Their role was to represent Israel before God and to offer sacrifices that atoned for or covered over the sins of the people. But, he points out, the priests were themselves morally flawed people, and so they constantly had to offer sacrifices for their own sins as well as for everybody else's. Something more was needed. And so he then argues that Jesus was that something more. He's the ultimate priest. But Jesus did not come from the line of Aaron. Rather, Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, that mysterious priest king from ancient Jerusalem, and he appears in the stories about Abraham. We also find in Psalm 110 that the messianic king from the line of David will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the author's whole point is this: Jesus is the ultimate priest king. He's morally flawless, he's eternally available for his people, and so he's superior to any other mediator between God and humans. And thus comes his warning in this section. To reject Jesus is to reject one's best and only chance to be fully reconciled to God, so don't do that. Which transitions us into the last comparison in chapters 8 through 10. The author shows how Jesus' death on the cross was the ultimate sacrifice, superior to all the animal sacrifices offered in the temple. Those sacrifices had to be offered constantly, both daily but also yearly on the Day of Atonement. Jesus offered his life once and for all, and it was sufficient to cover the sins of the whole world. And so the author warns the audience from walking away from Jesus. It's like turning your back on a gracious offer of God's forgiveness. Why would you do that? Jesus' sacrifice is permanent, he says, and it's the foundation for the new covenant spoken of in the prophets, where all sins are forgiven. So now that the author has elevated Jesus through all of these contrasts, this final section is one big challenge to follow Jesus. So think big picture. In Jesus, they have found God's very word. In Jesus, they have hope for the new creation. Jesus is their eternal priest. He's the perfect sacrifice. And so now they should follow all the great models of faith found throughout the story of the scriptures, and they should remain faithful to Jesus, trusting that despite whatever hardship and persecution, God will not abandon his people. That's the basic flow of thought throughout the letter, which the author calls right here at the very end a brief word of exhortation. Here's a couple of extra tips for reading this letter. Whenever the author quotes from the Old Testament scriptures, which is like every other sentence, stop and go look up the reference and read that quotation in its original context. And sometimes you'll be puzzled, but more often you'll see all kinds of extra cool connections that you would never notice otherwise. It's totally worth the effort. You should also just know that these warning passages, they're going to make you uncomfortable, and that's kind of the point. They're not there to make you afraid. They're there to show you that rejecting Jesus is foolish because he's so awesome. These warnings all serve the larger purpose of the letter, to show that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy. And that's what the letter of the Hebrews is all about.
There you go. 8 minutes and 16 seconds through the contents of Hebrews. As he talks a little bit fast, you can go back to it and watch it again. But he does a great job of overviewing the whole letter. And you can see here on the side of my screen that he does the same thing. Here's Titus, here's Philemon, here's Hebrews, here's James, here's 1 Peter, here's 2 Peter. The Bible Project on YouTube is a great source to get an overview, a quick overview, quick and dirty. You know, it's not, you know, you might want to refine it a little bit. That's what I'm going to do for us in a minute. But as an overview, to get you to be able to see the whole book visually as well as listen to it, it's a great source and well worth all of you knowing about. So that's the overview of the contents of Hebrews, visually and in terms of auditory learning tonight. And now I want to move from that, thinking that you will remember parts of it, not all of it. And by the way, there's no test on this tonight. I've decided I'm going to let you off the hook, and there's going to be no no exam on this tonight. So you're off the hook on that. Now what I want to do is pull up another screen to share with you. So I'm going to quit sharing this screen. And I'm going to start sharing another screen, I hope. Let's see if I can do this correctly. I didn't do it correctly. Let's see if I can do it correctly. Share your screen, Jim. And go here. Yep. And take that off. So now everybody can hear me again, right? Good.
Yes.
Good. Isn't that fun? I really think that's a fun way to get used to looking at the overview of each of the Bible books. But what I want to talk with you now is about something they didn't mention to you about Hebrews, which is really a key to understanding the letter. He said that we don't know who the author of Hebrews is. That's very true. There are all kinds of names that are proposed for the author of Hebrews, female names as well as male names. Some people that think that maybe Priscilla of the husband and wife team, Aquila and Priscilla might have written the book of Hebrews. There have been all sorts of proposals. But the point is, the author never puts herself or himself forward in such a way that we can identify them. We do know that they were associated with the apostles, like the video said. The reference inside Hebrews tells us that from internal evidence. But there's a lot that we don't know about Hebrews. One thing we do know. It seems like there is not only a lot of Old Testament in Hebrews, but it's true that there's a lot of rhetoric in Hebrews. A lot of stuff that sounds like Paul's rhetoric. And so the Apostle Paul, for a long time in the early church, was considered the author of this book. But Paul always identifies himself. He always starts off his letters, Paul, an apostle, right? And Hebrews doesn't do that. And so when we got around to the modern era and people really began to look at the way that writing is done, the vocabulary that's used, lots of other things, it's been pretty well determined. No, this isn't Paul. It's somebody else. We don't know who. But the rhetoric that you find in Hebrews is a lot like the rhetoric that you find in a Pauline letter. And so I want to talk with you a little bit about rhetoric and help you understand how rhetoric was so important in the first century world. So I always love to start off with this quotation by C.S. Lewis. The first qualification for judging any piece of workmanship, from a corkscrew to a cathedral, is to know what it is, and that is what it was intended to do and how it's meant to be used. And there's old Clive Staples at his desk working away. I want to work away on rhetoric this evening, so let me see if I can get there. We go. Let's make this a little bit bigger. There we go. So when I was studying for my PhD, I met a fellow who was also studying at the same time, Ben Witherington. And Ben has written a book about Paul. And because he talks about Paul, he talks a lot about rhetoric. And so what he has to say about rhetoric in general in the first century applies not only to Paul, but also to the writer of Hebrews, as we're going to see when we take a look at the rhetoric of chapter 1, which is going to be the third part of what we want to do tonight. But here's part of what he says about the importance of rhetoric in the first century. Lots of references to it in contemporary writers in the literature of the first century, Greek writers, Roman writers, and you can see its influence even in Jewish literature in the first century. Rhetoric has to do with how you form words together into sentences and paragraphs in order to persuade. And Ben says in his book, by the first century, rhetoric had become the primary discipline of Roman higher education. And that begs the question, well, what was education like in the first century in the Greco-Roman world? And basically, when we see that word higher education, we think college. But you really need to think about what we would call today secondary education after primary education. Most people were completely uneducated, illiterate. But many people were educated in rudimentary ways. we'll call it primary education. If you went beyond that, and we know that Paul did, for instance, and we know that a number of people did, then your primary discipline would not be reading, writing, or arithmetic, but it would be how to express yourself in such a way as to persuade people of what you were trying to tell them. Rhetoric became the primary discipline of Roman higher education. There are reasons for that. Think about the way in which government worked. Think about the way in which economics worked. Think about the way in which the military worked. Think about the way in which religion worked, whether you're talking Greco-Roman religion or think about how all communication was happening orally. And again, that doesn't mean that no books were written. We know they were, but the primary means of communicating was oral communication. So rhetoric was extremely important. Ben says an educated person dedicated a considerable portion of his or her educational years to learning rhetoric. We know, for example, that rabbinic training had to do with how to persuade people of the meaning of the Torah, according to the rabbi that you were studying with, and how to, what we would call, preach in the synagogue out of the Torah. And a number of people say, with some good reason, that Hebrews may well have been a sermon or a collection of excerpts from sermons by a preacher. And that's because preaching in the first century in the synagogue had a lot to do with rhetoric, persuading people of an interpretation of the Torah. Actually, to tell you the truth about Tyler and I and the other pastors you've listened to in your lifetime, we are trying to persuade you of the truth of the interpretation that we see in the scripture. And so we haven't come a long way in that regard. We're doing the same thing. If you read early church fathers' commentaries on books of the New Testament, if you look at what they have to say about their reading of the New Testament, the Gospels or the letters or the book of Hebrews or Revelation, when you look at commentaries that come from the period near the time of the writing of the New Testament, near the first century, not in it, but near it, within and near in New Testament scholarship terms, near has to do with the first probably 150 to 200 years after the first century. But remember, this is an oral culture, and so traditions persist in an oral culture. But when you read early church fathers' commentaries, like those, for example, of a wonderful preacher who was called the golden-tongued preacher. So he was the Billy Graham of the early church fathers. John Chrysostom. Then you become aware immediately that those who lived in a rhetorical environment recognized many New Testament letters for what they were. Rhetorical speeches that were framed by a letter framework. Rhetorical speeches inside the framework of a letter. We know, for example, that Paul dictated many, if not most, of his letters. And some of the people who wrote down and took dictation for him and produced the written form of the letter, for example, in the 16th chapter of Romans, a fellow by the name of Tertius says, I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you. And that means that Paul spoke words, and Tertius took them down in a shorthand, read them back to Paul. Paul said, yeah, that's what I want to say, or would modify them. And as he did that, Tertius would write them down on the papyrus scroll or the vellum parchment, whichever was being used originally for the letter of the Romans. And that's the way that the letter would take shape. So transfer that now from Paul's letters to the letter to the Hebrews, and think about someone who might have been writing down in shorthand a sermon that was given, or writing down several sermons and stitching them together. That's probably the way in which Hebrews was produced. So what is rhetoric? I told you it's the art of persuasion. The definition comes from Aristotle. It began in the Greek era. It persisted in the Greco-Roman era. It influenced not only Greeks and Romans, but also Jews, and we've talked about that. What kinds of rhetoric are there? There are three kinds of rhetoric, according to Aristotle. And these three kinds of rhetoric persisted throughout the Greco-Roman era. That means the first century and beyond until the fall of the Roman Empire. They thought of rhetoric in terms of three kinds, kind of like you would think of three kinds of movies: a science fiction movie, a horror movie, and a biographical movie. Three kinds of rhetoric, three forms of persuasion that were to be used in different ways. The first kind was called judicial or forensic. And Aristotle said this is used when you're in a courtroom, and it's used when you are trying to argue a case. And you know, we argue cases when we talk all the time, not only in the courtroom. I know I'm right about this. No, you're wrong about this, and here's why. I know I'm right. Here's why. Judicial or forensic rhetoric. The second kind of rhetoric was called deliberative. Deliberative. When consuls get together, when assemblies get together, and assemblies, there were civic assemblies, for example, in Greco-Roman cities like Corinth, the town council was called the decurion, and the governor would meet with the decurion, and together they would form the government for Corinth. But when you meet in an assembly, you're deliberating a question. You're not arguing right and wrong, despite what our Congress may look like right now. You're not arguing forensically. You're meant to be deliberating on what is the best course of action for the city or for the people. That's called deliberative rhetoric. The third kind of rhetoric has a strange name. It comes directly from Greek into English. You just take the Greek letters and translate them to English letters, and it's called epideictic. Epideictic. Epideictic is rhetoric that's used to praise something as virtuous or noble or good. Or conversely, epideictic rhetoric can be used to blame, to say this is not good, this is not right, this is not just. Epideictic rhetoric. Actually, we're in 1 Corinthians 13 with Tyler right now, and it's a great example of epideictic rhetoric. 1 Corinthians 13 is written in praise of love. And we've been learning about how and why love needs to be praised. And we're going to learn some more over the weeks to come, I'm sure. So forensic rhetoric, deliberative rhetoric, epideictic rhetoric, three kinds of rhetoric. Now, what's interesting is that the time orientation of each of these is different. If you're deliberating, what you're deliberating on is a future course of action. And you're trying to urge people to take a future course of action or dissuade people from taking a future course of action. Deliberative rhetoric. For the person who is the forensic rhetor, a litigator, your focus is on the past, because prosecution and defense make claims about what has happened. If you're prosecuting a case, you're saying this happened. If you're defending a case, you're saying, no, this happened. And think now not only in terms of the law court, but as I said, you can think in terms of right and wrong in almost any sphere. This is right. Why? Because it shows that it's right from the past. This is right. Why? This is wrong. Why? Forensic rhetoric. And for the display order, epideictic rhetoric, the present is the most important. Why does Paul write 1 Corinthians 13? What's right in the middle between chapter 12 and chapter 14? Chapter 12 introduces the problem. The Corinthian church is divided by the way in which it wants to prize certain gifts above other gifts. And the church is divided. We've known that since 1 Corinthians chapter 1. One of the ways it's divided is because some people think their gifts are more important than others. And Paul wants to insert the praise of self-effacing, self-giving, self-sacrificing love as the way past the impasse of all of the groups at Corinth saying, I'm better than you are, for whatever reason. So they all have a different time frame, the three kinds of rhetoric. Each kind of rhetoric also has a different objective, different purpose, what they're trying to achieve. The objective of deliberative rhetoric is advantage or harm. You exhort people because it's advantageous for them. You try to dissuade people because it's harmful to them. Now think about what you saw in Hebrews. Warning people, don't turn your back on this, seeking to dissuade them. Remember who Jesus Christ is, seeking to encourage them to embrace what is advantageous and walk away from what is harmful. How do you embrace what is advantageous to you? By putting your faith and trust in Christ. Don't turn your back on him. Deliberative rhetoric. We see that in Hebrews. And the object, go down to the last bullet point here, the objective of the display order of epideictic is to show the nobility of what's good and the baseness, Aristotle says, of what's not good. And the most noble, the best good, the most complete revelation of God, the one through whom God has spoken and revealed himself in a greater way than through the Torah that was given by the angels to Moses, is through his Son, who is the imprint of God's signet ring and the great reflection of God's glory. And so we find Hebrews is primarily an example of deliberative and epideictic rhetoric. And oftentimes in a speech, the different kinds of rhetoric would be mixed. In fact, more often than not, very seldom is a speech all formed of one kind of rhetoric. And so Hebrews displays the traits of deliberate. Let's think with me. Why would you turn back from the Christianity that you've embraced and the faith that you put in Jesus Christ? Why would you turn back again to Judaism as though the Messiah had not been given when he has been given? Why would you do that? How disadvantageous that is to you. And remember again why the revelation of Christ is the most complete revelation of who God is. Hebrews is an amazingly Christological book of the New Testament. And it also is an amazing attempt to exhort people not to turn back to Judaism. So last slide on rhetoric. Rhetoric is pervasive in the first century. Rhetoric has three forms: to deliberate, to prosecute, or to praise. And they have different time frames and they're pursued for different purposes. So how do you get all of that into a speech? How do we recognize rhetoric when we see it in a letter? Well, typically a letter that was structured rhetorically, and we're not just talking about New Testament letters here. We're talking, for example, of a writer like Cicero, who wrote what we would call today letters to the editor. Only there were no newspapers to publish in Rome. And so he would publish treatises, opinions about the emperors, or about the policies that were being embraced by the Senate. And typically these would be rhetorical speeches framed inside the framework of a letter that would be published in the way that letters were published. In other words, somebody would get a copy of it and say, have you read what Cicero wrote about Emperor so-and-so? Or have you read, let me read this to you. Or they would call their friends together into their house, have a dinner party and say, have you read Cicero's latest letter about what the Senate is doing? And then they would read it out loud. They would discuss it. But rhetoric was recognizable because of these five things. An exordium. This would be the way the speech would be introduced in the letter. It was meant to make the listeners well disposed to what followed. Then there would typically come what was called a narratio, which would explain the history that called forth the speech. Then there would be the proposition of the speech that would present the position of the speaker. Then there would be arguments. They were called probatio, or proofs, that supported the proposition. And finally, at the end, there would be a summary, what was called in Latin the per oratio, a summary and a concluding appeal. Now, let's take those five parts of an ancient speech and think a little bit more about Hebrew. I've already told you that the kind of rhetoric in Hebrews is a mixed kind, quite common. It includes sections of epideictic, teaching about who Jesus Christ is, and deliberative rhetoric that is full of calls and exhortations not to leave what they have trusted in Christ behind them and go back to Judaism. So here's the structure of Hebrews. It does indeed have an introduction, an exordium, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute, but it's found in chapter 1 and verses 1 through 4. And this introduction, remember the purpose of the exordium. It's meant to bring about a relationship between the writer or the speaker and the reader. And we're going to see that verses 1 through 4 do that. And then we find the proposition, and that's in there as well. Then the proofs, 7 expositions in chapter 1, paired with 7 exhortations in chapter 1. We're going to take a look at those. And then we find the other arguments in the body of Hebrews. Toward the end, we find the peroratio in chapter 12. And finally, and this is the only reason why we call the letter to the Hebrews the letter to the Hebrews. There's a conclusion that looks like it's the conclusion of a letter at the end of Hebrews. No letter introduction like Paul's letter introductions, but a letter conclusion like the letter conclusions that Paul writes or other New Testament letter writers write. So exordium, probatio, peroratio, and epistolary conclusion. Does rhetoric help us understand Hebrews? Yes. Why? 3 reasons. It tells us the author was a well-educated person. The author of Hebrews was a well-educated person. Remember we said the primary form of education in higher education that went beyond rudimentary education in the ancient world was rhetoric. Hebrews is a highly rhetorical document. Secondly, rhetoric is helpful to us because the purpose of Hebrews is both to praise and to persuade. That's the purpose of rhetoric, to persuade or dissuade. And it's the purpose primarily of deliberative rhetoric. Think about this. Think about this with me. Let me show you why through what I say to you. Let me persuade you. And in the course of persuading you, I want to praise someone. I want to praise Jesus as the highest form of God's revelation, the most complete revelation of God, of God's character, of God's glory, of who God is. And finally, rhetoric helps us understand Hebrews because it helps us understand the structure of Hebrews is organized in terms of exposition, positive teaching, and exhortation, warnings. Don't do this or do this. Teaching, exposition, exhortation. Do something about what I've told you and what you believe is true. Take your belief, turn them into action. Stop doing what you're doing, remember what you believe, and go a different direction. That's what the structure of Hebrews is all about. That's why rhetoric helps us understand Hebrews. And I want to show you now some things about Hebrews chapter 1 in our last 15 minutes or so tonight. So I'm going to stop this screen share. I'm going to go to one more screen share. Hopefully. Yes. I'm going to share that with you. And now I really do encourage you to pick up your Bible in Hebrews chapter 1 and read along with me if you've got one. I want to read to you what are probably, or arguably at least, the 2 verses that betray the most about Christology in the New Testament. The argument would be probably between Philippians chapter 2, the Christ hymn, and this passage in Hebrews, for the way in which they help us understand who Jesus Christ is, what we would call early Christology. Here it is in my translation. In many and various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, God has spoken to us by a Son. Let's take just that much. That's the first half of the introduction, the opening. Let me unpack it just a little bit for you. Many ways. I'd like for you just to think for a minute about the many ways in which God revealed God's own self in the Old Testament. Dreams, visions, poetry, prophecy, words spoken through the mouth of a donkey, words spoken out of a bush that was being consumed by fire but was never burned up. Think about all of the ways in which God spoke about who God was and what he was going to do and what he wanted his people to be and to do in the Old Testament. In many and various ways, God spoke. That's a past tense. And spoke of old, but here comes the important three words. Remember that the introduction of speech is supposed to create a relationship between the speaker and the audience. That relationship is created with three words: to our, O-U-R, fathers. In other words, the writer is speaking from a Jewish background to people who are primarily of a Jewish background. There's the relationship. You and I have the same background. We all know those 7 stories that the video highlighted for you. We know about creation. We know about fall. We know about the giving of the law to Moses. We know about the wandering in the wilderness. We know about the failure to reach the promised land. There's a relationship between us. We know the same stuff, and we have the same heritage. We're of the same race. In many and various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers. And then it says by the prophets. And immediately you think, well, he's just talking about the Old Testament prophetic books that we know about, right? Well, it's true that the Old Testament canon developed into 3 large sections that were called the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings. But the word prophet means someone who speaks for God. That's what the word literally means. So if the donkey that was ridden by Balaam all of a sudden speaks with God's voice, then the donkey, my friends, is a prophet. The donkey is speaking for God. If the bush that's out there in the wilderness, burning, suddenly begins to speak God's word, God speaks through it in the same way that God speaks through the prophet. So you need to give this word prophet its full definition. Someone who speaks for God. In many and various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets. And then comes the but of verse 2. Hebrews is full of contrasts. If you just go through Hebrews sometime and circle every time you find the word B-U-T, you'll be very surprised. The reason is because Hebrews wants to make contrasts. Here comes the contrast. But in these last days, present as opposed to past, God has spoken, different than God spoke. Has spoken means spoke prior to now and continues to speak in now, and now is when the letter of the Hebrews is being written. Again, we don't know exactly when, probably before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Because if the writer of the Hebrews had known about the destruction of the temple, it's felt by almost everybody who's looked at the letter, he would have included that fact. And look, the temple is destroyed, so we know the old covenant's been superseded because the priest can't offer sacrifices anymore. But he doesn't say that, so most people think probably somewhere between 60 and 70 AD. In these last days, God has spoken and continues to speak to us. That's what has spoken means. By a son, whom he appointed the heir of all things. We're going to find out that means every created thing, because the Son is the one who participated in their creation, the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world, and he reflects the glory of God. Moses' face reflected the glory of God when he came down from the mountain. Jesus Christ reflects the glory of God in a greater way. That's part of what the Transfiguration story is all about. On the top of the Mount of Transfiguration, it's not Jesus' face that glows, but Jesus' whole garments, his whole self glows. And Hebrews is picking up on this. And who bears the very stamp of God's nature and upholds the universe by his word of power. When he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And then you have these strange words, having become as much superior to angels, as the name he's obtained is more excellent than theirs. And the video did a good job of explaining why angels come into the story at this point. Because according to Jewish tradition, based on Torah, the angels were the ones who brought the words of God to Moses on the mountain. So angels are, in fact, the most reputable, the most honorable, the most complete bearers of God's word that we meet in the Old Testament. They are the emissaries of God who bring God's word to Moses. The angels are the ones who you would think of first as being closest to God. And you would think in a first century relational world that those who were closest to God would know God most profoundly and be able to bear God's words most clearly to God's people. So they come into the story at this point. But Hebrews says God has spoken to us through his Son. And in Hebrews, the verses that I read to you just a moment ago, we find 7 ways that God has spoken to us and continues to speak to us through his Son, and why we should listen. The Son is the heir of all things. The Son is the one through whom God created the world. The Son is the one who reflects the glory of God most completely. The Son is the one who bears the very stamp of God's nature. The Son is the one who upholds the universe by his word of power. The Son is the one who's made purification for sins. And the Son is the one who sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So that description of Jesus Christ in the opening of Hebrews is a 7-fold description. And you know 7 is the number for completeness. And what the writer of Hebrews is saying is the Son has made a complete and full revelation. Indirectly, he's saying every other revelation of God in the Old Testament is wonderful, but it's impartial and incomplete in comparison to the revelation that's been made to us through the Son. And then, I'm not going to read these verses to you, but I'm going to talk to you about them. In verses 4 through 14, we find, in parallel to the 7 ways that the Son is the most complete revelation of God, 7 ways the Son's revelation is a fuller, more complete revelation than the revelation of the angels to Moses on the Mount Sinai. Number 1, why is the revelation of the Son more complete, more full? Why wouldn't you go back from the revelation of Christ to the revelation of Moses? Why wouldn't you turn away from your faith in Christ, especially in times of Jewish persecution, which we know the ancient church endured? Why wouldn't you say, I'm going back to Judaism? Because the Son has a unique relationship to God. The words are, you are my son, in verse 5a. They come from Psalm 2:7, where the words are, the Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have fathered you. Psalm 2 was terrifically important to the Christology of the early church and of the New Testament. God does not call everyone my son. He does call some people son, but he does not say, today I have begotten you. I love the translation of the NIV, which is a lot better than begotten, because we don't say that I begot my daughter Hope. We say, I fathered my daughter Hope. So I like, you are my son, today I have fathered you. God does not say that about anyone else. That's why Psalm 2 was so important to the early Christians. Second way that the Son reveals the God more fully than the angels. God certainly doesn't ever say to an angel, I have fathered you. The angels are created beings, and that's the way they're described in both Old and New Testament. Second way, an anointed king. I will be his father, he will be my son. This is verse 5b and 2 Samuel. This is the promise made to David. I will be his father, he will be my son. You know the Messiah was meant to be the son of David. And so the writer of Hebrews is repeating the Davidic promise for the Davidic Messiah. And David was God's anointed king in the Old Testament. The expectation was another anointed king like David would come to sit upon his throne. The writer of Hebrews is saying, that's not going to be an angel. That was and is Jesus Christ. Third way, worthy of worship. This picks up on a phrase in Deuteronomy 32:43 in the Septuagint. It's not found in the Hebrew. It indicates that the writer of Hebrews was familiar with the Septuagint wording. The Septuagint of Deuteronomy 32:43 says, "Let all the angels worship him." The actual Septuagint text says, "Delight, O heavens, with him, and worship him, you sons of God." That's the Hebrew text that's taken over into the English translation. And so you can see what the writer of Hebrews and the translators of Septuagint were working with, because angels are called sons of God often. Another way the Son of God is superior to the angels. The angels' forms and functions in the Old Testament are temporary. Hebrews says he makes his angels winds and flames of fire. Now, that's not only an Old Testament reference, is it? Think for a minute with me about Acts chapter 2. How does the Spirit of God make himself visible? Through tongues of flame and a great wind that filled the whole house. The Spirit of God was the Spirit of God falling upon the early Christian church in the same way that the words of God were being brought to Moses on top of the mountain. The author of Hebrews seems to be thinking perhaps in ways that are similar, but in any case, his point is the form of angels in the Old Testament varies. They're spiritual creatures. They can take on different forms. They can take on different appearances. And their functions are temporary. They're given jobs to do, and they do them. But the Son's form and function are eternal. Psalm 45, verses 6 and 7, are quoted exactly in Hebrews in chapter 1 and verses 8 and 9. Psalm 45 says, and Hebrews 1, 8 and 9 says, "Your throne, O God, will last forever." Notice these words address Jesus as, "O God." Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom. You love righteousness and hate wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has set you above your companions by anointing you with the oil of joy. These verses of Psalm 45, the writer of Hebrews says, are talking about Jesus. They're describing why Jesus is greater than the angels. Angels have never received any words like that said about them. Another way the Son is superior to the angels. The Son is the uncreated creator of all things. The Son is eternal. The Son is unchangeable. The writer of Hebrews in verses 10 through 12 is relying on Psalm 102, verses 25 through 27. Again, in the Septuagint, this is the translation. "In the beginning, you, O Lord, laid down the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. And all like a garment will be worn out, and like a covering you will roll them up, and they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will not come to an end." One last way the Son is superior to the angels. The Son has received a unique promise. The promise is the promise of Psalm 110, which was recognized as a messianic psalm in the intertestamental period. The writer of Hebrews says it this way in verse 13. "To what angel has God ever said, 'Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a stool for your feet, a footstool'?" That's the last part of Hebrews chapter 1. Here's the exhortation. Based on those 7 things, the 7 characteristics of Christ revealed to you in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 2, the 7 ways in which the superiority of Christ is demonstrated in comparison to the angels, or in contrast to angels. Each of those 7 ways in verses 4 through 14 reflects on an Old Testament text. In light of all of that, who you know Jesus to be in verse 2, and who the Old Testament proves him to be in verses 4 through 14. In light of all that, Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1 starts off and says, in light of all that exposition, let me exhort you, and I'll exhort me with you. Therefore, you and I, we must pay closer attention to what we've heard. It means what we've heard about Jesus in the Old Testament, and what we've heard about Jesus in New Testament preaching, what he's talked about in chapter 1. We must pay closer attention to all of this, lest we drift away from it. And there, folks, is the proposition of Hebrews. Hebrews is written to try and deter, to try and dissuade people from who were Jewish and believed in Jesus, that he really was the Messiah, try and dissuade them from giving up that belief in the midst of persecution. And that's how the rhetoric of Hebrews helps us to understand the purpose of the letter. You can follow through with the other sections of Hebrews that you find in that introductory video that we watched, and you'll see the same thing happening. We move from indicative to imperative, from exposition to exhortation, from what is truth to how we need to respond to truth, how we must respond to truth. And preachers do this all the time. We move from what we call teaching to what we call application in our day, right? And we move back and forth in a sermon. Well, if this is true, then, we really need to behave like this. And that's what the author of Hebrews does. And that's why many people think that Hebrews began his life as a sermon that turned into an example of rhetoric and was framed with a letter framework at the end and became known as the letter to the Hebrews. 7:59, I tell you what, a few more weeks of doing this, Tyler, and I might get good at it. I can even end on time. Let's make sure that I get all of you unmuted and that I stop sharing my screen, and we'll see what you all think of all this. Okay, participants. Unmute all. There we go. Yes. It says you all can unmute all of yourselves now. The button's down there on the lower left. So I know we've covered a lot. I know you heard somebody talk even faster than me, and then you had to listen to me because I wanted to cover 3 things with you tonight. And that's all I hope you'll remember. I hope you'll remember something about the contents of Hebrews. I hope you'll remember that Hebrews is an example of ancient rhetoric, as are most of the letters to the New Testament, and what that means. And I hope you'll remember the 3 kinds of rhetoric. One has to do with helping a group of people deliberate about what's right or wrong. Another one has to do with proving something in court, arguing something. Now, this is right, that's wrong. You're in the right, you're in the wrong. And the final one has to do with praising something as virtuous or noble or good or true. And on the other hand, blaming something or proving the opposite, something is not good, that it's not true. And those 3 kinds of rhetoric show up over and over again in the letters of Paul and here in the letters to the Hebrews. And we've walked our way through Hebrews chapter 1, which I got to admit to you, before I taught Hebrews, I really didn't think that much about it. I knew it was in the New Testament. I'd read through it a few times, but I didn't think that carefully about it. But Hebrews is a rich source of theology. And we're going to see that again next week when Joe Betteridge takes the floor. And he's going to talk about a particular part of the theology of the book of Hebrews. And I'll let him say a few words about that in just a second. But again, if you don't fill up the floor quick with a preacher, they'll start talking. And so I'm sorry I started talking at you again. What have you got to say?
Look up, Joe.
Totally different subject, Jim. Your classmates at your PhD in England were quite a rich group of people.
They really were, Tom. I think back on that a lot. And a lot of them made good, a lot better than this guy sitting in front of you. In terms of publications and everything else. Yeah, it's a lot of fun to watch and see where people are.
This was a really good introduction to Hebrews, I thought. You taught us a lot of things I hadn't heard before.
Good, I'm glad that was true.
Yeah.
Jim, I know we pressed you on Theophilus and on Lazarus and Luke.
You got another chance now.
But the unanswerable question, if you had to give an answer though, who do you think wrote Hebrews?
Apollos. Apollos. I think he's the most likely. The only hesitation is that a number of quotations come from the Hebrew. There are a number from the Septuagint, and that's Apollos' background, a Jewish Christian from Egypt. And some people question whether he would have that much familiar with what became the Masoretic text, is always the way I should say that. But I think Apollos, he was the guy who knew how to preach, and he was the guy that Paul recognizes in the first 3 chapters of 1 Corinthians as I planted, Apollos watered, and God gave the growth. So I think it's likely, but can't prove it.
You mentioned female voices. Priscilla, anyone else? Any other theories?
Yeah, this book by Richard Bauckham, remember I mentioned it to you last week about women in the New Testament and in the Gospels in particular, the women of the Gospels. He makes a really interesting and I found really kind of persuasive argument about the woman who's named in Luke chapter 8. In Luke chapter 8, and verses 1 through 3, Luke says, the only gospel writer to say this, that there were a group of women who followed Jesus during his time in Galilee. And they become, 2 of them become witnesses of Jesus' resurrection in Luke chapter 24. And they are Mary Magdalene and, I can't think of it. This is why it's bad to become old as a teacher. Anyway, the third woman is a woman named Junia, and her husband is in Herod's employ as a steward or the manager of a household. And Bauckham argues that Junia is a Greek name, and that it can be Latinized as the name of the woman who appears in Romans chapter 16 as along with her husband. And Paul calls them persons of note among the apostles in Romans 16. So some people, and Bauckham even says, it's possible that she might be the author.
Jim, do you think Hebrews went through many drafts?
If it is notes from a collection of sermons rather than one continuous sermon, I think that it would be very possible. If it's a sermon that was delivered once and somebody, and I talked about shorthand, and you all might have thought, well, he's just, kind of retrograding that back in the 1st century. They didn't have shorthand. Actually, we know they did. And you could follow a speaker fairly closely. So if it was delivered once, I would tend to doubt that. If it's something that was composed and dictated over several dictation periods, or if it's something that was put together from notes from several different sermons, and those sections that you saw were different sermons, then very likely, Joe.
One time we wrote a stewardship letter, and almost everybody on the session pitched in, and unlike one would think a committee do something, goof it up, it's one of the most fabulous stewardship letters we ever sent out. And it went through many, many, many drafts. And so I've been thinking about that for many years, that stewardship letter written by the whole session, draft after draft. And I wonder if Paul wrote it with many drafts from the session.
Well, then we have to identify the session, don't we? Because they're co-authors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my wild theory.
Okay. You can have anyone you want. About Hebrews. The video did a great job of saying what you do and don't know about Hebrews at the beginning. We don't know who the author was. We don't know exactly who the audience was. We got some clues about their ethnic origins and some clues about the relationship of the author to the apostles. That's why it got in the canon. You needed a connection to an apostle to get into the canon. But there's so much we don't know. So obviously, it wasn't important for us to know the name of the author or exactly who the people in the audience were. What was important for us was to know the message.
So you want coming attractions?
Yes, please. Give us coming attractions.
So the warning part, and going to deal with chapter 6, which I think is one of the most difficult texts in the whole New Testament.
Yeah.
and it's about if you're a Christian, can you ever lose your salvation? And you think of people that were just on fire for Christ, and then this group I was associated with for a little while last summer. And so I'm going to call in this study of, can I feel safe forever and ever? And do I know that my destiny is absolutely safe and happy? Or do I always have to be anxious about bad things that'll happen to me and everything will go downhill? So we'll take a look at that first part of Hebrews 6. It's the thing some people refer to as once saved, always saved, and there's a whole bunch of different ways to say that. But I think if you see people wander from faith, and how do you think about yourself, So I think safety is a really important thing to think about, because we get anxious about our future. And not only do we get anxious about, our family, our kids, our finances, what about our eternal soul? And so we're going to talk about that. And
Good.
I might even quote the Westminster Campaign.
Oh, no. What you got to do is you got to go back to the source, Joe. You got to give us a devotional reading from Calvin's commentary.
Well, that's in there too.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. No, seriously, folks, this is
It's called the big phrase. It's called eternal security.
yeah. This is a really important part of your Reformed faith and our Presbyterian tradition, and it's one of the things that really stands out about each part of the family of faith in the denominations has particular parts of their beliefs and their practices that help them stand out. It's just like a family tree, you've got cousins and they're all different. And this is something that our cousins recognize about who we are, and most of them appreciate it. And some of them don't. Some of them would teach something different. Joe will probably tell you something about that. But
it's an important theme, and we'll explore it. I gave my theological library to a young bookseller in Portland, whose grandfather had been a Presbyterian elder in Seattle, but he'd gone off to one of the if I don't keep trying really hard, I might lose it. And I said, well, we're both going to go to heaven. It's just you're going to have a lot more anxiety than I do when you get there.
I love it. Well, thank you, faithful flock. We're going to try to get some other voices involved here, and some invitations have gone out. So far, nothing's come back. But remember that in the middle of this month, a great event happens on Monday night, and I'm sure that a number of us don't want to miss that live. So we'll take a break that week. But next week, come back and hear Joe. It's a hallmark of who you are, and Joe will be able to help you identify that and what the value of that is. And it's of great value to your faith. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Stop recording.